I knocked on the door and it opened slowly, as if the weight of whatever was behind it was waiting to fall on me. There he was, standing in the center of the room, his confused expression turning to defiance as soon as he saw me. But I didn't hesitate. I crossed the room with firm steps, ignoring the familiar smell of the perfume she wore that now permeated that treacherous space. I went to him, and the words came out clear and cold, "I'm divorcing her." Surprise danced across his face for a moment, and I could see him trying to find a way to respond, a way to justify what he had done, or perhaps to defend himself. But before he could say anything, I continued, more firmly. "If you think you're going to keep her and still take something from me, you're wrong." He tried to protest, and for a brief moment, I thought he was going to come to his senses, recognize the absurdity of the whole situation and back down. But he didn't back down. He smiled. A wicked smile, from someone who wasn't afraid to expose himself, and then I realized that he was willing to go further than I imagined. "Do you think you can just come here and solve everything?" he said, his voice filled with irritating arrogance. "I'm going to finish you off. I'm going to ruin you. I'm going to make you pay dearly for trying to fight me." And then, I saw the foul play begin. He used everything he had, manipulations, lies and, finally, an accusation. It was pathetic how much he was willing to expose himself, to turn a betrayal situation into something even more sordid. But I was ready. The evidence I had, the lawyers I consulted, everything was already prepared to face this battle. He wanted to take this to court, wanted me to kneel before him and admit defeat, but I knew he had no idea what he was about to face. It all started a few weeks earlier. The feeling that something wasn't right. Those vague, rehearsed excuses she made when I asked where she'd been, the way she looked away when I tried to have an honest conversation about what was going on between us. The love that seemed to slowly go down the drain, without me being able to hold it back, and all that was left were lies that accumulated like shards of glass. I didn't want to believe it, but one day, I followed my instincts. And what I found was devastating. They were together. Accomplice smiles, furtive touches, the kind of intimacy I hadn't seen between us in months. At first, I didn't know what to do. A part of me wanted to confront them there, to end this once and for all. But I needed to be smarter. I knew it wasn't enough to unmask them, I needed to end it all, and in a way that left nothing left for them to take from me. But it wasn't easy. Each day, I watched her come home, lying to my face, while I pretended I didn't know anything. I waited, I watched, I collected evidence. It wasn't just about them. It was about regaining the control I felt I had lost, about turning the tables in my favor. And then, when I had enough, I made my decision. That night, I got in the car and drove to his address. I knew they were together, I knew she had lied again to get out and see him. But this time, it was different. This time, I wasn't willing to be the victim. I parked and walked to the door, adrenaline coursing through my veins. He opened the door and seemed surprised, but quickly recovered his posture, as if he had control of the situation. There wasn't. "I'm divorcing her," I said, and I didn't expect to see fear on his face, just that same irritating arrogance. What happened next was a succession of quick moves, like a game of chess where no one wanted to lose. He tried to intimidate me, threatened that he would expose me, that he would do everything to ruin me. And I knew that his next step would be denunciation, a desperate attempt to silence me, to make it seem like I was the villain in the story. But I also had my cards. The legal battle began and, as expected, he did everything he could to discredit me. He tried to transform the narrative, to make it seem like I was a desperate, bitter man who couldn't accept the failure of his marriage. But the more he tried to crush me, the more his castle began to crumble. What he didn't know was that I had already gathered more information than he could imagine. Every time his lawyers tried to pressure me, I had a new piece to put on the board. Old messages, photos, witnesses who were willing to talk. And then, the truth began to emerge, and it wasn't just the betrayal that came to light. He wasn't just a lover. He was a man with a history of destruction, a predator who preyed on married women, feeding his ego by destroying relationships. And I made sure that this truth came out publicly, so that everyone could see who he really was. I divorced her. She was left with nothing. The lies that she and he built, those fragile walls that tried to hide the truth, crumbled in front of everyone. But the victory was not sweet. It wasn't how I had imagined. I had come out on top, yes, but what's the point of winning when you've already lost what mattered most? In the end, he tried to hide, he tried to sue me to clear his name. It was useless. During the trial, his mask fell, and it became clear to everyone that he was not just my wife's lover. He was an unscrupulous man, who took advantage of the weaknesses of others to feed his own sick needs. And I was there, watching as he tried to defend himself, watching his arrogance crumble in real time. Now, the question no one can answer is, how does someone get to that point? How does love turn into this game of power, manipulation, and betrayal? Have I really emerged victorious, or am I just another broken piece on a board that no longer belongs to me? When the curtain fell and the judge declared the end, all that was left was silence. I wanted it to be a full stop, but maybe it was just a comma, a pause before the real truth comes out. Because deep down, I feel like there's still something hidden, something I don't know yet. And it haunts me, because just when you think you know everything, that's when you realize that maybe you've been fooled once again. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not tolerate cheating in any way. Our stories are fictional, but they reflect a harsh truth. Betrayal destroys lives, corrodes relationships and leaves scars that not even time can erase. Each narrative serves as a warning, proof of how wrong choices can lead to chaos. Get ready for an intense story full of twists and turns. Take a deep breath, because what you are about to hear will shock you and hold your attention until the end. Good story. The living room had a spectacular view, a huge glass panel that allowed you to observe the constant movement of the city below. The late afternoon light passed through the glass, reflecting on the brown leather furniture and metallic details that gave the room a modern touch. It was an elegant, carefully decorated apartment, a perfect reflection of the successful and stable life that Robert and Catherine had built together over the past 10 years. Robert, a respected lawyer known for his determination and insight, has always had a firm and confident stance. He wasn't just good at what he did, he was a born strategist. From an early age, he knew he wanted more than a stable career, he wanted to be remembered. And this desire for recognition was what drove him throughout his college years and beyond, in building his name in the market. It was not uncommon to see him sitting in his leather armchair, his face serious as he read complex case papers, with a cup of coffee next to him and the low sound of jazz echoing through the room. He liked to have control, to understand every detail before acting. This was how he felt safe, this was how he kept his life on track. Catherine, on the other hand, was the soft foil in Robert's life. Captivating, extroverted, and with a sensitivity that enchanted everyone around her, she worked as an interior designer, a profession that allowed her to explore her creativity and keen eye for detail. She was passionate about what she did and was often seen moving around, adjusting cushions, positioning flower vases or rearranging furniture until everything was perfect. She was someone who always put other people's needs before her own, a touch she said was part of her personality. And for many years, this soft, empathetic touch was the perfect balance to Robert's pragmatism. Their relationship began intensely and passionately. They met at a gala event where Catherine had been hired to decorate the venue and Robert was one of the guests of honor. He was there to receive an important award for his role in a high-profile case, and, between one glass of wine and another, his eyes met Catherine across the room. The attraction was immediate, and from that first meeting, it seemed like everything about them complemented each other. She brought lightness to his life, and he offered her a safe haven, something she always wanted after a childhood marked by instability. However, over the years, moments of lightness and relaxation began to become rare. Robert began spending more hours at the office, often arriving home late, exhausted and without the energy for long conversations. Catherine, who had always been understanding and patient, began to feel Robert's absence more deeply. There was still affection between them, but there was also a growing distance, like a slowly widening gap, difficult to ignore but at the same time difficult to address. She tried to keep the house alive, decorating every corner with care, transforming common spaces into cozy settings, but the truth is that, behind all that whimsy, she felt alone. Robert, although he seemed distant, still loved Catherine. He realized that something had changed, but he didn't know how to deal with it. Deep down, he thought that if he continued to dedicate himself to his work and ensure that everything was financially secure, things would take care of themselves. It was easier for him to deal with complicated contracts and complex clauses than to try to unravel the emotions that were hidden between the lines of Catherine's silences. But that didn't mean he didn't care, I just didn't know how to demonstrate it any other way. The routine that once seemed safe and comfortable now seemed to tighten like a suffocating shirt. Catherine continued to take care of the house and her work with the same enthusiasm as before, but inside, she felt increasingly restless, as if something was wrong, something she couldn't explain. There was a silent pain, a kind of emptiness that seemed to grow every night that Robert arrived late and went straight to the office instead of her. She wanted to rescue that love that brought them together so intensely in the beginning, but she didn't know how to do it alone. And this feeling of helplessness slowly consumed her. And there was the issue of travel. Robert has always traveled for work, but lately, they have become more frequent. He justified it by saying that they were necessary to close important agreements, something that Catherine understood, but which inevitably created more distance between them. She missed when he came home with stories to tell, when he brought little gifts that showed he had thought of her while he was away. Lately, he seemed more reserved, like he was keeping something to himself that he didn't want to share. One morning, while they were having breakfast together, Robert's phone rang and he walked away to answer it. Catherine watched him walk out onto the porch and close the glass door behind him. She tried not to be bothered, but the way he lowered his voice to whisper into the phone made her feel uneasy. When he returned, he smiled and told her he was just a customer, and she nodded, forcing a smile in response, but there was something about the way he avoided looking directly into her eyes that made her wonder if he was being completely honest. It was this kind of detail that was eating Catherine up inside. She always believed in mutual trust and didn't like the feeling that there were secrets between them. Instead of confronting him directly, she tried to ignore these little signs, convincing herself that she was overreacting, that he really was just overwhelmed with work. But these small doubts accumulated, and more she found herself questioning things that would previously have gone unnoticed. That day, Robert left earlier than usual, saying he had an important meeting. Catherine was left alone at the coffee table, the sound of silence heavy on her ears. The apartment, which she had always made a point of leaving impeccable and welcoming, now seemed like an empty set, a stage without actors. There was something lonely about it all, a loneliness she didn't know how to fill, and it scared her. She tried to distract herself at work, immersing herself in design projects, redesigning spaces, looking for inspiration in magazines and websites, but her mind always came back to the same question: where did things start to go wrong? She and Robert were perfect for each other, everyone said that. She remembered how he made her laugh, how they spent whole nights talking about their dreams, about the future they would build together. Now, it was as if she were sailing alone, without a clear destination, while he seemed to follow his own path, distant, unattainable. That night, when Robert finally arrived home, Catherine was waiting for him in the living room, with 2 glasses of wine and an expression he couldn't help but notice. She wanted to ask him about the distance, about what was going on, but when he walked in, tired and exhausted, the words disappeared. She handed him a glass, and he accepted it, sitting next to her. They drank in silence, each immersed in their own thoughts, trying to fill the void between them without knowing exactly how. Maybe it was just a phase, she thought, as she watched the way he twirled the glass between his fingers. Maybe they just needed a little more time together, a trip, a breather. But as she tried to find answers to her own fears, little did she know that what was coming would change everything, and that there was no turning back. Robert was not a man who left things to chance. His every move was calculated, every decision meticulously planned, and his career as a lawyer was proof of that. But lately, he was beginning to realize that there was a part of his life that was out of control, his marriage. There was something unstable, a constant discomfort that he couldn't shake, no matter how hard he tried. The look in Catherine's eyes, the smiles that didn't reach her eyes, the way she seemed to get lost in her own thoughts, all contributed to a growing sense that something was wrong. The silent nights and mornings of short dialogues began to take a toll, and Robert found himself remembering the first years of his relationship with Catherine, how easy the conversations were, how she lit up the room with her presence. Now the house seemed full of unspoken secrets, as if there was something pulsing beneath the surface that they both tried to ignore. He didn't want to admit that he might be losing control over the only thing that really mattered besides his job. The tension was palpable, and Robert realized he needed to take action. He decided to surprise Catherine with dinner at the restaurant where they had celebrated their first wedding anniversary. The idea was simple: reconnect, remember what had brought them together, try to find a way back to that love that seemed to dissipate. When he asked her, she accepted, but there was a hesitation in her smile that didn't go unnoticed. That night, Catherine got ready carefully. She stared into the mirror for a moment longer than usual, taking in the reflection of a woman she didn't completely recognize. She put on one of the dresses Robert liked and put on some soft lipstick, trying to ignore the feeling that she was just acting a part in a play she no longer wanted to act in. Upon arriving at the restaurant, the atmosphere was as familiar as it was strange, everything seemed the same, but something inside her had changed. During dinner, Robert did his best to liven up the conversation, bringing up funny stories from work and old memories that always made Catherine laugh. And she smiled, as she always did, but her eyes didn't shine like they used to. He tried not to let it get to him, but the feeling that something was being kept out of his reach only grew. When dinner came to an end, he suggested a walk around the city, but she declined, saying she was tired and wanted to go home. He nodded, resigned, and followed her back, feeling frustration settle in his chest. In the following days, Robert tried to convince himself that it was just a phase, that they would overcome it like so many other difficulties they had already faced. But distrust was a poison, and he began to notice little things he would have ignored before. The calls that Catherine made and answered in another room, the smiles she gave while typing messages on her cell phone, the way she seemed more absent every day. He needed to know what was happening, and the only way to get answers was to take more direct action. The following week, he decided to discreetly follow Catherine. He left the office early, informing his team that he needed time to resolve personal issues. He saw her leave the building where she worked, with a strange smile on her lips and an expression he hadn't seen in a long time. He followed her from afar, his heart beating faster with each step, until she entered a cafe. At first, Robert didn't understand, but then he saw a man enter shortly after, and she greeted him with a hug that left no room for doubt. The impact of seeing that gesture was like a punch in the stomach. Robert felt the ground disappear beneath his feet, adrenaline rushing through his veins as he tried to process what he saw. They sat down, and she was smiling, touching the other man's arm, leaning in to hear what he was saying, laughing in a way Robert hadn't seen her laugh in months. He walked away before he could be noticed, his mind in a whirl, trying to find some logic to it. Maybe it was a friend, maybe there was an explanation, he repeated to himself, but deep down he knew he was lying to himself. Over the next few days, Robert became restless. He wanted to confront her, ask who the man was, demand answers. But I was also afraid of the answers I would receive. He then preferred to observe a little more, try to understand what was happening before acting. Once again, he followed her, this time to a small hotel outside the center. Catherine entered the lobby without hesitation, and shortly after, the same man appeared. They went upstairs together, and Robert stood there, outside, staring at the hotel entrance, feeling like he was trapped in a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. He didn't wait to see what would happen next. He couldn't bear the thought of them hanging out together, laughing, sharing something he was no longer a part of. He returned home and spent hours sitting in the dark, trying to find a way out. The evidence was clear, and he knew he would need to confront Catherine at some point, but he needed to make sure that when he did, it would be final. He could not afford to lose this battle. Then, the next night, as she was getting ready to go out again, Robert stepped forward and said they needed to talk. Catherine hesitated for a moment, but then nodded and sat down, as if hoping that moment would come sooner or later. He looked at her, trying to find the woman he loved, trying to understand how this had happened. And then, bluntly, he asked, "Who is he?" Catherine froze. For a second, everything seemed to stop, and she didn't know what to say. But Robert didn't need to hear the answer. The silence and the expression on her face were enough to confirm everything he already knew. "It's true, then," he said, his voice quieter than he intended, but filled with a pain he couldn't hide. "You're betraying our marriage." She tried to justify, tried to explain, but the words were empty. Robert didn't want to hear excuses, he didn't want to know the reasons. The only thing he could feel was the crushing weight of a betrayal he would never have expected. And there, in that moment, as Catherine searched for some way to soften the impact, he knew that things would never be the same again. And even in the face of unbearable pain, there was something more, something that Robert still didn't know, something that was still hidden, and that he would only realize when the complete truth came to light. Robert spent the next few days in a haze of thoughts and strategies, trying to prepare himself for the confrontation he knew was inevitable. He couldn't just ignore what he had discovered. The weight of Catherine's betrayal was crushing, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't erase the image of her with another man from his mind. But there was one thing that intrigued him, that made pain and anger mix with bitter curiosity: his lover's arrogance. That confidence that the man showed when Catherine was around, as if he knew something that Robert didn't. And Robert hated not knowing. After a week of icy silence at home, he decided it was time to act. He sought out the best lawyers, gathered enough evidence to ensure that Catherine could not allege anything against him in a divorce proceeding. He wanted to make sure she left with as little as possible, he wanted to be ruthless, because deep down, he knew it wasn't just the betrayal that destroyed him, but the feeling of having been deceived for so long without realizing it. And he wanted answers. So when he set up a meeting with her at the law firm, it wasn't just to discuss the terms of the divorce, it was to extract the truth she had been hiding. Catherine arrived at the office, nervous, but trying to maintain her poise. From the night Robert confronted her, she knew things were about to change irreversibly. He tried several times to talk to him, to explain himself, but Robert was a wall. There were no gaps, there were no dialogues. He wouldn't allow her to explain, and she didn't know if that was a relief or a torment. But in that room, surrounded by his lawyers, she felt small, as if she were about to be tried and sentenced. Robert watched her from across the table, his eyes fixed, cold, without the slightest trace of the softness he used to have when looking at her. "We're going to get a divorce," he began, bluntly, with no room for negotiation. "And you won't walk away with anything, Catherine. Not a penny more than necessary." Those words were like a punch to her stomach. She knew he was hurt, but she didn't expect such coldness. "Robert, please." She began, her voice shaking. "I know you're furious, but can we at least try to resolve this in a more civil manner?" "Civilized." He laughed, but there was no humor in his laugh, just a dry, sharp sound. "You want to talk about civility after all? Spare me, Catherine." He gestured for the lawyers to leave, leaving them alone in the room. They hesitated for a moment, but then left, closing the door behind them. Robert needed privacy for what came next. The silence that followed was heavy, almost palpable. Catherine looked at Robert as if waiting for him to say something, anything that could alleviate the situation. But he was silent, just watching her, as if trying to read all the secrets hidden behind her eyes. Finally, he leaned forward, elbows resting on the table, and asked, "Who is he, Catherine?" She hesitated, and Robert noticed. The hesitation was the confirmation he needed. "I know you're cheating on me," he continued, his voice low and controlled. "And I know this isn't just any case. There's something more to it. So why don't you stop trying to deceive me and tell me once and for all who this man is?" Catherine took a deep breath, feeling her hands shake slightly as she rested them in her lap. She knew this moment would come, but still, she wasn't prepared for it. "He is just someone I met at work," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "It was a mistake, Robert. I know that. And I'm sorry." But Robert was not convinced. There was something about that response that seemed rehearsed, empty. He sat back in his chair, keeping his eyes fixed on her. "Just someone you met at work," he repeated, and the way he said it made Catherine shudder. "Then why did he try to report me, Catherine?" She looked at him, surprised. "What?" "I went to him," Robert revealed, tasting the words bitterly as he spoke them. "I went to his house, told him I would divorce you, and he tried to intimidate me, tried to sue me for defamation." He paused, watching the expression on her face change from confusion to panic. "But I won. Because, unlike you, Catherine, I am meticulous. I prepared for every move he could make." The revelation came as a shock to Catherine. She knew Robert could be ruthless, but she didn't imagine he would go so far as to directly confront her lover. And now, the entire situation seemed even more out of control. "Robert, I didn't know he did that. I swear. Stop lying." His voice echoed through the room, cutting like a blade. "I'm tired of your lies. Of all the secrets. I want the truth, Catherine, and I'm going to find out, one way or another." Catherine felt a wave of despair wash over her. She knew she was about to lose everything, but she still didn't understand the extent of what was happening. So, as a last desperate effort, she decided to tell the truth, or at least part of it. "Robert, I never wanted things to come to this," she said, her eyes teary. "I didn't want to hurt you. But he was different. He made me feel alive again, in a way I hadn't felt in a long time." Her words were like acid, burning away every part of the composure Robert tried to maintain. He took a deep breath, trying to control his rising anger. "Do you think that's an excuse?" he asked, his voice low and threatening. "Do you think you can just say you were bored and that justifies everything you did?" "No, it's not that." Catherine screamed, unable to hold back her tears. I just wanted something that would make me feel like I used to. Something that would remind me that I'm still someone, that I can still be happy." Robert shook his head in disbelief. He knew there was more to the story, something she wasn't saying yet. And then, in a sudden burst of clarity, he realized he would need another approach to get the truth out of her. "I did some research on him," he said calmly, watching as her expression changed, becoming more tense. "And you know what I found out, Catherine? I found out he has a history. He's been doing this for years. He gets involved with married women, destroys their marriages, and then disappears. He's a predator, and you were just another prey for him." Catherine opened her mouth to protest, but the words were lost. She didn't know what to say. The idea that the man she risked her marriage for was someone so manipulative left her feeling helpless. Robert stood up, walking around the table like a lion in its cage, and then turned to her with a hard, unforgiving expression. "Do you think he loves you?" he asked, and the way Catherine hesitated before answering was all he needed to understand the answer. "Robert, please." She began, but he raised his hand to silence her. "You don't understand, Catherine. I've already destroyed his life, and now I'm going to do the same to you. You won't get away with this." He paused, and then, with frightening calm, concluded, "I'm going to expose you. I'm going to show everyone who you really are." Catherine couldn't believe what she was hearing. "What are you going to do?" he asked, his voice barely audible, as if he feared the answer. "I'm going to make sure he's exposed for what he really is," said Robert. "And you'll watch from the sidelines as it happens. Because in the end, no matter how hard you try, I'll always be one step ahead." She looked at him, perplexed, and for the first time, she felt genuine fear of Robert. He was no longer the patient, loving husband he knew, he was someone willing to destroy everything to get revenge. And at that moment, as he left the room without looking back, she realized that the nightmare was just beginning. Robert left the meeting room with firm steps, leaving Catherine alone, slumped in her chair, enveloped in an oppressive silence. The confrontation had ended, but the conflict was still burning, and the embers were far from extinguished. For Robert, this was just the beginning of his meticulous revenge, one part of the plan he had been devising to ensure that both Catherine and her lover paid for what they had done. It wasn't just a divorce, it was about regaining control, restoring his dignity, and most of all, making those who wronged him feel the weight of their choices. Night fell, and Catherine returned home alone. The atmosphere in the apartment, which had previously been a kind of refuge, now seemed gloomy, oppressive. Everything around her reminded her of the choices she had made and the consequences that were now about to crash down on her. She couldn't forget Robert's look, that mix of anger and determination, as if he was willing to destroy everything around him just to see his revenge come true. The pain in her chest was suffocating, and the tears she'd held back at the meeting now fell free, burning her skin as a constant reminder of her betrayal. Meanwhile, Robert was in his office, with a glass of whiskey in hand, looking out the window at the city. He reflected on what he had just done and what he still planned. He had taken the first step by confronting Catherine, but he knew that to truly win this battle, he needed to unmask her lover in a way that would be devastating. And everything was ready. Documents, records, a list of women who, like Catherine, had fallen into that man's trap. The idea was simple: expose the pattern of behavior, show the world that it was not just a case of ordinary infidelity, but a series of coldly calculated manipulations. And then there was a part of Robert that still wondered what he would do after all this. He wondered if, in the end, he would actually feel any relief or satisfaction. He was about to destroy two people's lives, and as much as he felt it was the right thing to do to restore his own sanity, there was a deep uneasiness that he couldn't ignore. Would he become someone as cruel as that man, using tricks to bring others down without thinking twice? The next morning, Robert received an unexpected call. It was from Catherine's lawyer. The voice on the other end of the line was calm, but carried a veiled urgency. "She wants to talk to you, Robert. Not about the divorce, but about other things." There was a brief silence before he continued. "I think you should listen to her." Robert hesitated, but accepted the request. They found themselves in their apartment, the place that had been home to so many happy moments, now transformed into a kind of emotional battlefield. Catherine sat at the table, her eyes red and puffy, holding a cup of tea that she barely touched. When Robert entered, she looked up, and for a moment, he could almost see the woman he had fallen in love with so many years ago. But the anger and resentment were too strong for him to let it disarm him. "Did you want to talk to me?" Robert asked, his voice cold and distant. Catherine nodded and took a deep breath before starting to speak. "I know you want to punish me, Robert. And I understand. I really do. But there are things you don't know, and if you don't listen to what I have to say, you'll end up destroying more than just your life, two people." Robert crossed his arms, impassive. "You expect me to have any empathy after all this? After what I saw?" "No," she replied quickly, her voice breaking a little. "I don't expect that. But what I need to say could change the way you see all of this. The man I got involved with, he's more dangerous than you know." Robert narrowed his eyes. "Dangerous? I know exactly what he is, Catherine. A manipulator, a man who uses women to satisfy his own ego and then discards them. Is this news to you?" "It's not just that," she insisted. "I thought it was just an adventure, something that made me feel alive again, but then I realized, he uses what he knows about people to control them, to threaten them. He made me believe that if I tried to break it off, he would destroy everything I love, and I was scared, Robert." For a moment, Catherine's words seemed to echo in a void, as if Robert didn't know how to process them. "Are you trying to tell me you were coerced?" he asked, incredulity evident in his voice. "Because that sounds more like an excuse than anything else." "It's the truth," Catherine said firmly. "And if you don't believe me, that's fine. But if you continue with what you're planning, he'll turn it against you. He'll use everything he can to make it seem like you're the aggressor, not him." Robert felt a chill run up his spine. He had always believed he was in control, that he was one step ahead, but now he realized that perhaps he had underestimated his opponent. There was a complexity to the situation that he hadn't expected, and it irritated him deeply. "So what do you suggest I do? Give up? Accept it and pretend it never happened?" Catherine shook her head, eyes pleading. "No. But we can handle this another way. I know you hate me now, and I know nothing I say will change that. But I only ask one thing, don't let him use your anger to get you destroyed. Because that's what he's going to try to do." Robert didn't respond immediately. He walked away, walking to the window, looking at the city outside as he tried to process it all. He wanted revenge, he wanted justice, but for the first time he was beginning to realize that the path he was on might not lead to any of those things. Catherine had been disloyal, and he couldn't forgive her for that, but at the same time, there was something in her words that resonated with a truth he couldn't ignore. "You want me to trust you, after all?" he asked, still looking out the window. "No," she replied, and her voice was a whisper. "But I hope you trust yourself. Because you were always more than that, Robert. You always knew the difference between justice and revenge, and I think you still do." Robert closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the choice he needed to make. He knew there was still a path to the final confrontation, but he also knew that the decision he made now would define not only the future of Catherine and her lover, but his as well. And as he thought about everything that had happened, a cruel doubt began to arise. Was he about to cross a line that would make him unrecognizable to himself? The question now was not just exposing the lover, but understanding how to do this without falling into the same network of manipulations that he had built. And suddenly, Robert realized that, to win this battle, he would have to face not only an external enemy, but also what was inside him, the part that called for revenge at any cost. Robert sat in front of the monitor, observing every detail of the documents he had gathered. He had spent the last few days organizing everything, trying to find a way to expose Catherine's lover without falling into the trap she warned him about. There was an unsettling calm to his movements, a coolness that only someone about to execute a meticulous plan could have. He knew the resolution was close, but he also knew that the ending he sought could not be rushed. Strategy was essential. It was then that he made a decision: he would no longer confront his lover directly. Instead, he decided to use the same tactics he had used against so many other people. If this man had specialized in silently manipulating and destroying lives, then Robert would destroy him in the same way, but this time, in a legal and definitive way. He contacted an investigative reporter at a major newspaper and shared everything he had discovered. Photos, messages, testimonies from other women who had been victims of this predator. What he planned was not just a simple reckoning, it was a public exposure that would ruin the man's image forever. Meanwhile, Catherine was adrift, trying to keep her life together but increasingly crumbling under the weight of her own choices. She had lost Robert and, with him, the only pillar that still supported her. No matter how much she tried to move on, the constant fear that her lover could still ruin everything haunted her. The man she had chosen in a moment of weakness was not what she thought, and now, the only thing left was regret. Days later, the report was published. Catherine's lover, identified with name and photo, had his past exposed in a detailed and shocking way. The words used in the article were raw and direct: a serial manipulator who used charm to infiltrate the lives of vulnerable women, destroying marriages and threatening his victims into remaining silent. The newspaper gave enough details for anyone to understand the man's predatory profile. In a matter of hours, he had lost his job, become a pariah, and his name was on everyone's lips in a way he never imagined possible. But the final blow didn't just come from public exposure. Robert had found a way to contact one of the previous victims, who had sued her lover years ago for inappropriate behavior. The case had been hushed up at the time, but Robert brought it to light, offering legal support for her to reopen the case. It was the kind of maneuver that showed he wasn't just interested in revenge, he wanted justice, even if it was difficult and painful to watch. When the news spread, Catherine knew immediately that it had been Robert's doing. She tried to talk to him, but all attempts were ignored. There was nothing more to be said. In the last conversation they had, Robert had made it clear that he was no longer interested in her apology, that all he wanted now was for her to deal with the consequences of her own actions. He didn't intend to destroy her directly, but he wouldn't do anything to protect her from herself. And that's exactly what happened. Without Robert's support, Catherine was left to endure a difficult and emotionally exhausting divorce. She lost the home she loved and, with her lover's public exposure, she had to face the judgment of those around her. Friends and acquaintances who had previously seen her as a kind and trustworthy woman now looked at her with a mixture of pity and contempt, as if they were watching a spectacle of ruin. She tried to start over, tried to find some purpose, but shame and remorse were constant companions, haunting her every step. The lover, in turn, was destroyed in a way he could never have predicted. His desperate attempt to sue Robert for libel turned against him. During the trial, Robert's lawyers brought out all the evidence they had gathered, and the truth became clear to everyone. He wasn't just a casual lover, he was a skilled manipulator, and his attempt to use the judicial system to protect himself only worsened his situation. He lost everything, his reputation, his job, any credibility he had. And Robert? He got what he wanted, but not in the way he imagined. Victory did not bring the peace he so longed for. He had exposed the truth, destroyed the culprits, but that did not erase the pain he felt. It was a bitter feeling that, despite everything, something had been lost forever. The void that remained was too big to be filled with the taste of revenge. He watched everything fall apart, like a spectator at a tragic play, and realized that, in the end, there was something irreparable in the destruction of the love he and Catherine once had. The resolution for Robert was not a relief, but an acceptance. He moved on, dedicating himself more to work, seeking some stability in the things he could still control. He didn't become a more bitter person, but he learned to be more suspicious, to be more cautious. His friends tried to get him to meet new people, to try to find someone new, but he refused to open that door again, at least not yet. There were still wounds that needed to be healed. In the end, Robert learned that the truth is like a sharp edge that can hurt, but can also liberate. He didn't come out unscathed, but he came out stronger, in a way that even he didn't know was possible. And most of all, he understood that sometimes revenge is not a solution, but a necessity to feel whole again. And that realization, although painful, was what kept him moving forward, knowing that he did what needed to be done, not to fix the past, but to ensure he could look to the future without regrets. And so ends this intense story full of twists and turns. Now, we want to know your opinion. Comment what you thought of the story and what caught your attention the most. If you liked it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of the next stories. Remember, this channel never supports any type of betrayal. The stories are fictional and serve as a reminder of how thoughtless actions and betrayals can have devastating consequences. Until the next story.